agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. I'm joined today by Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum, Jay Carson. Hey, Jay.
Good morning, Mike. How are you?
I am hanging in there. How about you?
I'm good. I'm feeling better than a free-range pangolin in China. So
you had it. I like it. Anyway, before we get started today, I want to ask all of our listeners if you can maybe give us a hand actually in improving the Politics Guys. Over on our Bipartisan Politics Reddit group, I have a post called What You Love and Hate About the Politics Guys host, where I ask everyone to evaluate what you think the main strengths and weaknesses of all of us are. And we've already gotten some great feedback. It's going to be very helpful, but we would definitely appreciate more. And I'll put the link in today's show notes to that. But also, if you'd rather not go onto the Reddit page, you can just send us an email about individual hosting teams or any of your thoughts or ideas, because we're always looking to give you the best possible show possible. And of course, the best possible show possible. Geez. Okay. Anyway, need to work on that. But you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. And thanks so much in advance for helping us to keep on improving the show. So we're ad-free this week, which really I think is in large part due to the big downturn caused by, social distancing and stay-at-home orders. And we, like a lot of places, are definitely taking something of an economic hit, which is why we're especially grateful to the people who are doing okay and who've, stepped up to help us out. And I especially want to thank this week Mark and Lindsay, both of whom made very generous contributions to the show through PayPal. Now, while Patreon is our preferred platform because it makes it a lot easier for me to ensure that supporters are getting everything they're entitled to, I know some people aren't crazy about Patreon or, they just rather do a one-time donation as opposed to a monthly thing. But whether it's Patreon or PayPal, all of our supporters get access to a full-length bonus show each week, as well as other stuff at different levels of support. And for the last few weeks, I've actually been adding in a second full-length bonus show for supporters because with my classes at NKU going online, I've been doing audio recordings of my lectures, which I thought, I can release these on Patreon for supporters. And so far, I've hit Congress, the presidency, and the executive branch, and part one of the Supreme Court. And so still to come, if there's a part one, there's obviously a part two. And I'll also be talking about public policy and the 2020 elections. So to check all that out, you can go to patreon.com/politicsguys. And for PayPal, you'll find a support link at politicsguys.com/support. And those links are also always included in our show notes. Finally, if you like all this bonus content, but you can't afford to financially support the show right now, that's totally not a problem. Just email me, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will make sure you get access to everything that we're putting out there. So, Jay, I think obviously we're going to be starting with, what we've been talking about for a long time now. It's, of course, COVID-19, but a different aspect.
Well, kind of, sort of.
Yeah. A different aspect of it. So, because, as everyone, I think, who's not been living in a cave knows, there's been a lot of tension between President Trump and certain governors, at least, over the COVID-19 response. And a number of listeners have asked us to discuss federalism in the context of COVID-19. And this week, President Trump helped us out because the matter's really come to the fore. On Monday, the president says, when somebody's the president of the United States, the authority is total, and that's the way it's got to be. And then on Tuesday, he tweeted, tell the Democrat governors that Mutiny on the Bounty was one of my all-time favorite movies. A good old-fashioned mutiny every now and then is an exciting and invigorating thing to watch, especially when the mutineers need so much from the captain. Too easy. So
that ended up not working out real well for the captain, though.
The first thing I think I and a lot of people who actually knew the movie thought was, wait a second, does Donald Trump think Captain Bligh was the hero of Mutiny on the Bounty?
Although no, I do, Mike. I do want to interject something as a sailor, yachtsman, so forth. Captain Bligh, in many ways, is an incredible example, though, of seamanship and guts in that he was sort of set adrift in that little boat, and he literally made it back to England, more or less on his own. So in that sense, I just don't. Sometimes I think, you may not like Captain Bligh, but his seamanship skills cannot be questioned.
Hitler loved dogs, and anyway, but no, fair point. So I mean, obviously that was just Trumpian hyperbole, but it does bring up that question of federalism, certainly. And so, Jay, I wanted to get your thoughts on what you thought about that Monday comment, which was the more serious sort of thing, which he kind of sort of walked back a little bit, I guess you could say. And then that Tuesday tweet in terms of what you think it says about Donald Trump's view of the relationship between the federal government and the states, or, just federalism in general in this time of crisis. Well,
as you would expect, I'm a big fan of federalism, as are most conservatives. It is perhaps one of the cornerstones of sort of conservative doctrine, right? And I'll tell you, I did watch the Monday press conference, and I usually don't. It was just sort of happenstance that it was on, and I was watching it. But plainly, I mean, for me to try to psychoanalyze Donald Trump is again, that's beyond my scope.
Yeah.
But what he was saying would be consistent with someone who did not understand the principle of federalism. I guess that's the most charitable way I can put it. The president does not have absolute power. There are instances where the president has pretty significant power, particularly in emergencies. There are reasons where doctrines under which the federal government does have, not doctrine, it's actually a clause. It's called the Supremacy Clause, where the federal government does have supremacy to sort of act in contradict or order state action in some cases. But all those powers are sort of cabined by the Constitution. There's, it's not just a plenary, I'm the president and my power is absolute, as he said. Now, so that's my first thought. The other charitable reading, and maybe this is not charitable, there's a difference between authority and power. Now, Trump may in fact lack the constitutional authority to have sort of the ultimate power over these things. But he may have enough political power to get what he wants regardless. And that's not to make it sound sinister, because that's sort of what all presidents do, right? I mean, all of these checks and balances and so forth are subject to the political will ultimately of the voters. So if Trump believes that if he's going to make a statement saying, I declare the U.S. is open for business, and certain governors say, well, hold on, not our state, political pressure may grow upon those governors to get in line or not. I mean, that's the way it goes. And that sort of calculus,
Sure.
The actual constitutional power doesn't come into play. It's more just politics.
Yeah.
So that would be my other charitable reading, is maybe that's sort of what he meant. I don't think it was, though.
No.
I think it was just, Trump being Trump. So,
and of course, with that power and authority, most people would say, even if you grant that, which almost nobody really has, it comes with a level of responsibility. And
Sure.
and already President Trump has famously said that he's not responsible for any of this.
Yeah.
So, and that's kind of, I think, in the walking back, and when we saw the plan, the actual plan later on, or a few days ago, that the White House, that the administration released,
which is very federalist.
Yeah, and I think that's the president realizing, and in some of his later statements saying that, hey, this is up to the states, because while he would like I think he likes the idea of having absolute power, that idea of being responsible for anything is not something that is very appealing to him, and
Sure.
But also, in a way, it almost feels sort of sad and desperate to me. If you are a competent authoritarian, you don't really say that you have absolute power and all this. You just You just do these things.
Exactly.
Right?
Mussolini didn't need to tell people I have absolute power.
Yeah, you just act that way. And so in a way, I'm sort of grateful by the fact that, he's not a very good authoritarian, although he wishes he were. But, as to the more substantive issue of federalism, of course, a number of public health experts, a bunch of them actually, have been saying for a while that what we need are 50-state stay-at-home orders. And as of today, I believe there are still 5 states that haven't issued any, and all of these states have Republican governors: Arkansas, Iowa, Nebraska, North Dakota, and South Dakota. And also in states that there have just been partial orders. There are a couple of those: Oklahoma, Utah, and Wyoming. Again, all Republican states. But I should also point out, I think it's only fair to say that, with the very notable exception of South Dakota, which last time I checked, which was yesterday evening, has the 15th highest rate of coronavirus per capita, those other states all rank somewhat low to fairly low in per capita cases. So, I mean,
even if you're talking per capita in South Dakota, in real numbers, that's going to tend to be a fairly small number.
Right, because there just aren't that many. There just aren't that many people.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, you can say, I think, well, maybe that's an instance of South Dakota aside, where a lot of that was, concentrated in that one, that's a Smithfield plant, I believe. You can say, well, for the most part, maybe governors are making, wise decisions on that, and this is federalism sort of working. But on the other hand, you have states with governors who acted, early and aggressively, like I would say Ohio and Kentucky are 2 very good examples, and per capita rates of infection, at least positive tests, have been considerably lower than what you might expect. I mean, Ohio is 30th and Kentucky is 42nd. But then you can look right next door to Kentucky, say, in a state like Tennessee, where they waited a lot longer and the per capita rate is a lot higher. And then there's also the South Dakota thing. So, I mean, it seems to me that it's sort of a mixed bag here, that I guess that federalism works really well, or I would say that a national coordinated response might be better when you have a very competent leader at the helm who is wise and intelligent and all that sort of thing. But I mean, that's part of what makes federalism a good idea, is we can't always count on the president of the United States being incredibly competent and focused and all that. And so that's where someone like, say, a Mike DeWine can say, you know what, I'm not going to wait around for D.C. I'm just going to go ahead and do this thing. And so in that sense, it's, a lot depends on who you have at the top, which is just like, I could say I'm all in favor of a philosopher king, but, it's got to be the right philosopher king. So there's that. So that's kind of my take on it.
Well, here's, and I'll follow up on that, because you're right on a lot of things and maybe wrong on a little bit, but okay. The fact is that's the system we have. Whether it works well or not works well, and the goal of federalism is not necessarily there are a couple of goals, and this really goes to, I think, a lot of aspects of our Constitution. The goal is not to have the perfect government. The goal is to have a legitimate, accountable government. So that, look, if your governor didn't do so well in this crisis, then you've got recourse at the next election. It's also, as the Supreme Court has said, famously, that the states are sort of laboratories of democracy, and especially, I think, in this kind of situation where there are so many unknowns, conflicting data. Coming in and conflicting needs, right? Obviously, South Dakota is different than Ohio, is different than New York, different than California. So I think it certainly is sensible to allow those states to fashion whatever responses they feel appropriate. And in some states, they may feel, look, our risk, given our state's population, given our state's population density, given the industries that we work in, given those things, a stay-at-home order is, they're going to do that, balancing themselves, and live with that.
Yeah.
Right. And that's, so to me, that's why I think, not only I think is federalism system a better system, but it's the one. It is the one that is enshrined in the Constitution.
Yeah, and yeah, I agree. I agree largely because it is very helpful when you can make these decisions based on
here's what these guys did. How did it work out for them? Yeah.
And yeah. So another thing, though, I think, is that it's not necessarily an all or nothing thing. It's not a states you're on your own or I have total authority. And this is where I think we've seen some of the bigger failures. And, in our system, what I see as the role here, certainly the governors get to call many of these shots when it comes to public health and safety. But there's an important coordinating role when we're talking about national crises. And that's not taking charge. That's just making sure that there's not that much sand in the gears and things move smoothly to and from and so forth. And I think that's where we've seen some failures. And part of that is just because it's so difficult to ramp up from 0 to 100, in a very short period of time. But part of it also, I think, just has to do with, issues we've been talking about in the last, month or two about the administration the administration just sort of hoping this would go away.
Well, I think we all hoped it would go away. And I think in fairness, there were a lot of the advice that came out early was, look, it's not going to be this bad. And that was advice that was in the press, coming out of CDC and so forth. So, but setting that aside, and back to the federalism point, and this is something I think is kind of interesting because the place where there's the juncture, where that coordinating comes in, is with commerce, right? The Constitution has the Commerce Clause, which says that Congress shall have authority to regulate commerce among the states. And I had an interesting question from a friend and a listener, actually, after the Trump thing. So, what about the Commerce Clause? In terms of, doesn't that give the president authority to essentially enhance sweeping regulations or to overrule a state that says we want to stay closed? And the Trump president will say, no,
not really. I don't think. And I think, there have been cases. There have been cases before the Supreme Court about coercive, what you would call coercive federal government mandates to the states, and there have been some instances where.
But my first thought of that was Sebelius.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
The case, not the composer.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I think certainly you could argue that. Maybe it seems like there are things the federal government could do to force the issue, but I think when push came to shove, the courts would probably say that most of those things would be unconstitutionally coercive to the states.
Right, and I would agree, but I think it's an interesting question to throw out there. My other thing I looked at is, even so, I think whatever those actions would be, they would necessarily be congressional actions. Now, the president might do something pursuant to some authority given him by Congress. And for that, back to say something like a Wickard versus Filburn, right, that gave the Department of Agriculture the authority to set quotas on wheat. So still the executive was taking a very big step into regulating very individual parts of people's lives. But that was also being done pursuant to congressional authority. So
right. Right now we have the Defense Production Act, which is sort of the main example. The main thing in play here that I and a lot of folks on the left feel that the president should be making a much more aggressive use of.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
All right.
Why isn't President Trump commanding more?
Well, yeah. Well, coordinate. Certainly, I would say coordinating more. Absolutely. Yeah. Right. Let's kind of move on. We've been focusing a lot over the last few months on sort of latest development type of things. And I think that's understandable given the situation we're dealing with. But I think it's sometimes good to try to take a step or two back and consider more generally how things are going, basically, with something this big. And it can be really easy to not do that, to be caught up in the moment by moment, especially when it's so, when it's so affecting everyone's real life in such a tangible way. And so I've been thinking a lot about this because, in part, this week I asked my upper level class in American political institutions to answer 4 questions about kind of a big overview thing and provide their best possible justifications for their responses. And, I thought it occurred to me, wow, this would make for a really great discussion on the show. And so, Jay, I know we talked about this before and you agreed. And so what we're going to do next is I'll raise these 4 questions one at a time, and then we'll talk about our answers to them and how we came about those answers. So, Jay, if you're ready to go.
I'm ready to go.
Okay, here we go. The first question I asked is, how would you rate the Trump administration's preparation for the COVID-19 pandemic? So things that happened in 2019 and before, basically. And the options I gave to my students and what we'll be using today is we're going to force ourselves into clear answers, categories. Exceptional, very good, good, mediocre, bad, very bad, and awful. So a standard kind of 7-point scale. So, Jay,
somewhat satisfied, somewhat, yeah.
Exactly. So on that scale, using those 7 descriptors, which one would you say is, in your view, the best fit for, again, not the response to, but the Trump administration's preparation for the COVID-19 pandemic, or really, since we couldn't have known it was COVID-19, any pandemic? Which, before you mention that, I got to say that it just occurred to me, and I don't know if you heard about this, but it's earlier this week, Kellyanne Conway was giving some kind of interview or briefing, and she said something like, well, the WHO should have known because, hey, it's COVID-19, folks. And like the idea being that there were 18 before that. Right. No, it's the year there, Kellyanne. So there was no correction on that. But anyway, I thought it made me roll my eyes and groan at the same time. But anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
So I would say mediocre to maybe, again, I guess what we're measuring against is the baseline of how prepared can you be against any pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
Absolutely.
So, and also what costs do you have to incur or weigh against what would be, I guess, absolute preparation?
Good point. Yeah.
Right. So I think there's sort of a cost benefit analysis there. And it's one of these things that it's not even necessarily conscious cost benefit analysis. It's sort of a look, when you have a 100-year pandemic every 100 years, you tend to forget about it, and it tends to fade in your memory as far as policy priorities, right? Because you say, hell, that hasn't happened in 100 years. So in that respect, look, it absolutely could have been better. On the other hand, to guard against every type of possible pandemic is one, difficult, if not impossible, to predict what's coming down the pike next. And second, it might not be the best use of your resources when you have other, more pressing issues.
Immigration.
No,
pouring in across the borders.
And I'll throw in, perhaps this is unfair, but look, about a year or so ago, maybe not even that long ago, you and I had a discussion about should the CDC be studying gun violence. My response was no. The CDC ought to be expending its resources looking at infectious diseases. But that's that's an argument that any group, any government entity has limited resources, and where is it going to apply them? And people were making the argument, look, gun violence is a really big problem. We ought to focus more resources on that. And then sort of, inherent, implicit, I don't think it was a conscious thing, but there was sort of when have we had a real pandemic? Now, I suppose you could say SARS and MERS and so forth, but they obviously weren't anywhere near the scope of what we're experiencing now. So that's how I arrive at my mediocre to maybe even mediocre plus, but
okay. Yeah.
Or mediocre with understanding, I guess.
Okay.
Right.
Sure.
That maybe mediocre is about as good as you can ever do with this kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah. I think that seems like a I get what you're saying there. On the CDC thing, I think just for clarification, I think my argument was that the CDC should be able to fund it as opposed to doing it themselves, because of course epidemiologists doing gun violence research. But anyway,
but again, that funding could also have been CDC could have funded. Hey, should we fund some pandemic response guys?
Your larger point, I get. Yeah. Now, my response to that question is I would be somewhere between the very bad and awful. Raging more closely toward awful. And to put this in context, I would give the Obama administration a grade of either bad or very bad. So I think the Obama administration largely dropped the ball on this, and then the Trump administration just took the ball and just set it on fire, basically, and threw it down a sewer. So here are my reasons for that. All of the stuff that you mentioned about, making these trade-offs and so forth, we have to consider in the context of a lot of people were giving warnings about this, the seriousness of this, for several decades. And we have had scares like the SARS and the MERS thing that were, close calls, easily could have been, if a few things had been different, a lot worse. And there were all kinds of exercises and scenarios that were played out. So this idea that we couldn't have expected this, no, a lot of people knew that it was just a matter of time before we were going to get something like this, if not worse. And so I don't think in the first place that the Obama administration did nearly enough to ramp up for that. But secondly, I think why the Trump administration is worse in this sense, much worse, is that they actually went in the opposite direction. So the Obama administration didn't grow resources and build capability enough, but the Trump administration went in the other way. And this is stuff we've talked about in the show already, eliminating the Global Pandemic Group and the NSC, not staffing up key agencies, not having a pandemic plan in place, not having, sufficient emergency responses, that sort of thing. So to me, that translates into either very bad or awful, and probably push comes to shove, I'd call it awful.
Okay. I'd push back a little bit on, and we could talk about this some other time, but on the pandemic task force and NSC, I mean, in reality, what would happen was a lot of those folks were just rolled into a larger NSC organization. They got rid of that specific pandemic task force, but we still had the employees, we still had the capabilities. It was just sort of a government reshuffling. Now, it may or not have been the wisest or the best, but again, it's one of those things of you're looking at efficiencies and what do we need and what do we need right now, placed in that respect. I don't know that
my response to that would be is that's the larger problem with the Republican view of government, is it's all about efficiency and just in time and as little as possible. And then when something big and tragic and awful happens, the government's just not prepared to deal with it. And so that's why I think, other things being equal, largely Democratic governments are going to be in a far better position to deal with this sort of thing than Republican governments. But again, that's a much bigger conversation for another time, certainly.
Sure. Okay, question 2.
Okay. How would you rate the Trump administration's response to the COVID-19 pandemic? Again, using the same scale. So this is everything from really beginning of January to today. Same scale.
Okay. So I'd want to draw maybe a little line of distinction between the Trump administration and Trump.
Well, he is sort of part of the administration.
I know. But there are sort of the what the administration does
and what he says,
and there's what Trump says.
Okay, no, that's fair. Yeah, absolutely.
And for example, I would say the CDC, Dr. Fauci, and so forth are part of the Trump administration, but they are not Trump.
Even though let's clarify it then a little bit, I guess, because if we say what has the executive branch bureaucracy response been, that's one thing. When we're talking about Trump administration, we're sort of talking, I think, more about Donald Trump,
about the White House staff and appointed political.
Yeah, as opposed to Fauci, who's been around for decades, basically, and just as kind of a carryover from past administrations. Because I think pretty much everyone seems to think, outside of, I don't know, maybe Fox News or something, that he's doing an excellent job.
Sure. I would say that the Trump administration, the Trump response has been bad.
Okay.
to put it in Trump terms, very bad.
Okay. The worst, all caps. No.
And I say that in terms of not any particular policy issue, but rather just the tone, the lack of, this is the old word, gravitas. And I'm looking at that in terms of what I've seen here in Ohio with Governor DeWine.
Yeah.
And I may not, I may or may not agree with absolutely everything that DeWine has done. But there's no doubt in my mind that he is a very serious person and is considering these issues very seriously, and is viewing this as, I want to do what's best for the state of Ohio, its people, its businesses, its economy, its health, and so forth.
Right.
The Trumpian response has been this more of the, this is all about me, and it's the the Democrats or the media out to get me, and again, just sort of a lack of seriousness, I guess. So that's now, again, I'm not pointing at any direct policy issues, because I don't have huge disagreements on policy stuff. I mean,
just more leadership. Yeah. Okay.
Exactly. More just the. It's almost as if Winston Churchill during the Blitz or something, if he'd gone out and just really complained about the Labor Party. You know what I mean? It's sort of like the bombs are falling. You know what I mean? It's sort of the.
No prime minister has ever been more persecuted than I have. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And so I think that in that sense, I would rate him bad, because this is in many ways. I don't want to say this is something that presidents look for, hope for, whatever. I certainly wouldn't say that, but this is that opportunity, those moments where, look, if you're there, you get the opportunity to really step up, and do something important. You get to be, FDR after Pearl Harbor. You get, you know what I mean? You get, it's almost.
But at the heart of leadership, and I think you'll agree with this, is putting others before yourself. And if you're incapable of doing that, then you're going to be a bad leader. Doesn't matter.
And there's this very much this sense of, for real leaders, a sense of, look, the game's on the line here. Put me in, coach.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That sort of, and not this sort of like, well, I'm this guy who did, that.
Sure.
So no, that's how I arrive at my bad or very bad. As Trump might say.
Mine would be a little worse. That's because not only do I agree with you on the leadership,
worse than very bad.
Well, yeah,
terrible.
But not only do I agree with you on the leadership question or lack thereof, but I have some policy issues as well. Things like, again, I feel like the Defense Production Act should have been invoked earlier and still should be invoked much more aggressively to do things. I feel like the CDC really blew it. And so this is really more, I guess this starts to get more into just general bureaucratic response. I mean, there were the WHO.
That's why I was trying to draw the line there.
Yeah, I know. And that's fair. So I should say that, but also that, the president saying things obviously like anyone who wants a test can get a test, like a month ago. And to me, that's like the Trump administration's version of the Obama. You remember the Obama, and some conservatives still say,
like your health plan, yeah.
And this is a much worse version of it, of course, because it's a literal life and death thing for a lot of folks. But anyway, so yeah, I think I certainly agree with you about that, and especially during a time like this, the president shouldn't be out in front just flat out lying about things, which he just can't seem to help himself doing.
Well, I don't know. I'll tell you, I don't know that sometimes with Trump it's lying. Like if you want a test, you can get a test.
Is this a George Costanza thing where as long as you believe it's not a lie?
And I don't know whether it's this is something he's told by his people, or that it's just stuff he just says.
Let me give you an example.
In some respects, I do think there is an element of that.
But I mean, let me give you an example. Like just a couple days ago, the president said testing is an all-time high and it's growing at an historic rate. And that's just
true.
No, that's actually not true. If you pull up the COVID tracking project data, testing is not at an all-time high. Just by daily new tests, it's simply not. Testing is largely stalled out or maybe growing slightly larger, but it was actually much higher at a number of other dates. And it's just not growing at a historic rate. I mean, it's growing very slowly and it's largely stalled out. So these are things that are just clear, factual untruths.
How are you measuring testing though? Is it pure number of tests done? Is
new
it
tests every day?
Is it
new tests every day? And so these things are just not true. And he keeps on, especially the testing thing really bothers me because, of course, with this whole plan to get the country moving again, which I certainly support doing as soon as is safely possible, that all relies on testing. And the fact of the matter is we're stalled out at around 150,000 or so tests a day. And almost everyone who knows anything about this says we need to be at around 500,000 tests a day. And there's no clear way for us to get from 150 to 500 without removing a lot of these bottlenecks. And there are some pretty significant bottlenecks in terms of supplies at this point, largely. And so this idea that somehow that the president really seems to want to believe in hard enough and it'll be true, that somehow all this will be fixed by May 1st, that's just magical thinking. And I don't want a president who's, engaged in magical thinking about something like this.
Yeah. Well, on the testing issue, and this is maybe go a little off track.
Yeah.
I mean, this sort of goes to a bigger philosophical thing, I think, that you and I differ, a lot of conservatives and liberals differ on, is just the capability of the government. Now, as I understand, a lot of this has to do with the lack of the testing reagent.
And things like swabs as well. Yeah. But basic supplies.
Also, but I think, as I understand it, some of the other, like the test tubes and the swabs, those are more easily solved, right? You can find another supplier for those. It's just sort of logistics thing, or somebody can shift or do that. It's getting this reagent. And in many cases, so many folks on the left sort of, while ironically often rejecting a sort of more traditional faith, believe that the government is omnipotent, right? That somehow or another, if Trump just commanded more reagent to be there, it would be there. I think this is just one of those. Look, it's you got to make the stuff. We didn't have the stuff. Nobody has the stuff.
There are some people who have too much faith in that. Just we can make it so. But I think what most people on the left, myself included, believe is that the problem is largely one of coordination. And that's where we still have a situation where governors are battling in the open market to try to find these things. And,
right.
And since this is a global thing, the fact that we don't have a whole lot of U.S. capability for a lot of things. I think there's one place in the country that makes the swabs that we need for this. And so this is where
they're making more at Ohio State now.
Well, what's that?
They're making more at Ohio State.
Well, that's great, but this is where the federal government's coordination abilities come in. This is what the Defense Production Act was, in a sense, designed to do, is the federal government saying, you know what, you're going to make these, we're going to buy all of them, and we're going to parcel them out based on need, as opposed to, well, let's just see if New York outbids Texas for these things. And that's just not a good way to run things.
Well, although there is as I understand, there was a federal clearinghouse sort of that rations this stuff to the states. They had so much, and then each state gets its allocation, and then the problem is that states have received that allocation, but everybody needs more. So,
well, and part of the problem with that is the allocations have been anything but transparent, and then you've had the president saying that, well, if people aren't going to be appreciative enough, that we're not going to talk to them, and whether or not that's how things are going, that goes back to this is not the message you send, is saying that, hey, this is an example to get more fealty from the governors in exchange for me maybe helping to save some lives in their states. Not a good message to be sure.
A little bit nicer, Mike. You might get your testing.
Exactly.
That's what I'm saying.
Exactly. All right. So question 3, how would you rate Congress's preparation for the COVID-19 pandemic? Again, on that same scale, Jay?
I'd say good. Again, looking at preparation and in Congress, I guess I would draw a distinction between Congress and the executive branch.
Yeah, absolutely.
Congress's job isn't so much to be prepared for stuff. Congress's job is more to be reactive, right? Now you can say, we should have allocated more for this program or that program in the past. But again, I think that's a tough call to make. I mean, I think we had resources, but again, it's one of those. Does the 100-year thing, and again, 100-year doesn't mean it happens every 100 years on the dot, although this one was pretty close. it's not predictable like that. It's not, we're going to have a pandemic in 2 years. Let's start socking away more money or investing more in pandemic research. And even so, I'm not clear exactly what you can do when you get a novel virus. It's necessarily novel, and you got to work off that to develop a vaccine quickly. You can't have a general. It's not like you could have a general vaccine just sort of sitting around ready to go.
Sure.
So in that respect, I would say good. Now, and also I look at Congress more in terms of the economic response. And that happened fairly quickly.
That's response, though. That's the fourth question. So let's hang on.
Yeah. Okay.
That's
All right.
a separate question, but we will get to that. So for me, I'd rate it as very bad because I disagree with your premise. I believe that Congress actually does have a role before these things happen, and it is in building up programs and allocating funds. So, for instance, I think that Congress has been, for decades, underfunding public health programs or grants to public health programs at the state and local level. And these are our first line responders, and they were pretty quickly overwhelmed. I also think that Congress has been clearly underfunding the Strategic National Stockpile. They've been cutting HHS preparation funding. So I think in a lot of ways, a lot of us on the left say, well, it was no problem for Congress to pass a $1.5 trillion tax cut, but yet even a fraction of that.
It was a problem.
Well, it was something there was the political will to do, certainly, but there wasn't the political will to, say, the funding for the stockpile, for instance, which, there's been obviously problems with it being overwhelmed. It's been around $600 to $700 million a year. And so, the agency in charge of it, I forget the name, last year said, hey, we need like $1 billion or more to make sure that our expired drugs are replenished and we have, up-to-date equipment, and that didn't happen. So we're not talking about massive amounts of money here. And so I think that Congress has fallen down on the job. And again, this is not just for the last few years. This is a long-term thing. And in terms of the 100-year sort of thing, yeah, but we've had some warning shots here. So it's not like this came out of the blue. You mentioned the SARS and the MERS and all kinds of warnings. And so I think Congress has really not done a very good job in preparing on that.
Let me ask the question, though, is that would we necessarily think that more expenditures in the past, say, a couple years ago, would have made that much a difference against this?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean,
okay.
if state and local public health departments were better funded, I think that would make a big difference through grants. I mean, the fact that
no. I mean, so you have more money. What do you do with it?
Well, you have the personnel on the ground to do tracing and to do things like, all the things that public health offices do.
But that wasn't the problem. The problem is we just didn't have enough actual physical reagent stuff, and also with tracing on this. The difficulty is you have a situation where this disease is so weird, where a significant minority, by some estimates, 30% up to half, have no or minimal symptoms, and also it doesn't. You're contagious even before you have symptoms, and so it's. I'm thinking that's the tracing issue. You could sort of say, well, look, we have tons of employees to go trace people, but unless you have the facilities to test absolutely everyone, which is what we're going to eventually gear up for, that's not going to be that effective, I don't think.
Well,
just because of the weird nature of this disease.
Sure. Well, as for the testing thing, the CDC test was very flawed, and a lot of people in that community say it's interesting to note that the WHO test, which the president's now holding funding on because of their awful. Well, the China thing's a separate story, and I tend to actually agree in part with the president on that. But the CDC dropped the ball pretty clearly on the testing on that, and that's more of a response than a preparation. And so,
okay.
I mean,
all right, so we'll move on to response now.
Yeah, but so. The last question, how would you rate Congress's response to the COVID-19 pandemic? And you can go ahead and start us off again, Jay.
So I'm going to say Congress's response good so far for the reasons that we that I set forth before,
Okay.
and on prior shows. Again, it's one of these things where it's not easy for me and my conservative soul to say, boy, I'm really glad Congress is spending $2 trillion. But that said, this is the type of emergency when that kind of action is needed. Now, I think some of the issues that have occurred, and this is something that's endemic with Congress, with government, with anything. If you say, look, this was an issue with the Obama stimulus, of we're going to allocate however many hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars to these programs, but it's how do you actually get it out there? It's sort of you can say we're turning on all the water in all the water departments, but unless you have a hose, to hook up to the fire hydrant, the water doesn't get where it needs to go.
Right. That's what liberals have been saying forever, is that our government is just too small. And so when we have things like that, we just don't have the governmental infrastructure to get it out.
Keep in mind, a lot of this, though, for example, the SBA funding, that is always operated and necessarily and smartly, I think, through private institutions. You don't get a loan directly from the government. You get a loan from the bank that's backed up by the government.
Sure.
Which gets money through the Fed. So I think it is just a matter of we are trying to pump sort of like fire hydrant type pressure amounts of water sort of through a garden hose, and that's
absolutely
the issue. So
yeah, absolutely. So I would say that Congress's response has been mediocre. On the positive side, I think Congress moved at for Congress a relatively quick pace to approve a pretty massive, a massive aid package.
Massive.
Now, I think that there were more. I think it could have been more. I think it could have been better in some ways. There were a few partisan delays on both sides, really, that, a matter of days doesn't seem like a lot. But if the whole thing had been approved a week earlier, that, for some people, that can really make a true difference. I'm concerned right now about difficulties Congress is having in building on that. I think right now we need Congress actively debating and developing a phase 4 package. And there seems to be some hesitancy on the right to do that. And I think the more time we're able to spend working this out beforehand, the fewer problems there are going to be when it comes to implementation. And along with that, I think it's unconscionable that Congress has not developed a plan to work and vote remotely, at least much more formal kind of plan. Obviously, informally, they're doing tons of that. And that's in a way where I'm going to defend, this is weird, I'm going to defend Representative Thomas Massey, who he got a lot of heat. I think it was like a week and a half ago or so. He was demanding an in-person roll call vote as opposed to unanimous consent for, I forget what it was. And a lot of people said, he's putting lives in danger. But from what I understand, I read into it, what Massey's point is he was arguing that Congress needs, or the House in this case, needs a remote voting system so that when these big things are being done, members of Congress are on the record and it's just not a unanimous consent thing. And I thought, you know what? That's an entirely reasonable and important point. And I get that, Mitch McConnell claims to be big traditionalist of the Senate. And, Daniel Webster didn't vote through email or, did Zoom conferences or anything like that. But, I think it's high time that we see something like that and Congress develop something like that so they can be as effective as possible in times when we most need Congress to be working and doing stuff, and they've kind of had to build up an infrastructure out of nothing. And that certainly has caused delays. And those delays are going to be felt both in terms of economic and health consequences for a lot of Americans. Yeah.
Well, we touched on this a couple of weeks ago, and I would agree that, that adaptation ought to be put together as soon as possible, if not, beforehand. Right.
Yeah.
Even if you have an imperfect system to do that. My concern, my fear, as a traditionalist, is that then becomes the norm. Not this is the emergency procedure. We can only vote will vote by remotely
Right.
all the time.
Because
I
can't be
think
like, well, my
something's
kid
lost.
has a recital, so yeah, I'm going to vote remotely or something like that. Yeah,
Yeah,
I see what you're saying.
because I think something is lost when you don't have people actually there face to face working together. So often, people say that the one of the problems in Washington is now it's the loss of collegiality that these people don't as they used to sort of go out afterwards, drink after, carouse together, that sort of thing. That there was this sort of a camaraderie that led to more compromise, and that would be my fear, is that otherwise everyone is just sort of siloed off and they just vote the party line from remotely from wherever they happen to be.
Yeah, I think that part of it is
my caveat to that. Obviously, this is an exception.
Yeah.
But it should be viewed as an exception, and again, not just we'll use this because it's kind of inconvenient for people to vote this time.
Yeah. One final thing I wanted to mention, I kind of briefly alluded to it, and I feel like I should expand on this, and is that the whole World Health Organization issue. Of course, that was, I guess you could say, I don't know, I'd say a minor issue, but it certainly was the thing that came up this week with the administration saying that they're going to withhold funding for the WHO, already appropriated funding by Congress, pending an investigation, into their how they've handled this crisis and so forth. And a lot of people on the left are certainly saying that this is Donald Trump trying to shift blame or shift the focus to anyone but himself. And I certainly think that's part of it. But I also think, it's important to not reflexively say, well, if the administration's saying it or doing it, it's bad or wrong. Because in this case, even though I think the WHO's response has generally been pretty good, it seems to me, looking into the evidence, pretty clear that the WHO was far too willing to just sort of say, oh, yeah, these are Chinese numbers, and I'm sure they're fine, and China's doing a wonderful job. And so
they in fact did congratulate President Xi on the great job he's been doing.
Yeah. As did Donald Trump, of course, but that's a
well. And they also the World Health Organization also made statements saying, well, we can't really say that this began in China.
Yeah.
Again, to me So I think you're mostly right. I would say Trump maybe goofed on the timing of this, right? Because I think on the merits he's correct, and the fact that we've had the wailing and gnashing of teeth from the WHO and from all these other countries who could certainly freely up their contribution if they wanted, sort of tells the story. But
on the other hand,
I wouldn't have. What I'm saying is, politically, I wouldn't have done it, injected it now.
No.
In the midst of the crisis, I would have waited a couple months from now as things have stabilized and said, oh, you know what, WHO, now we're going to take a look.
Exactly. Yeah, and I totally agree with that. And I think that's something that absolutely does need to be investigated. And, I think on the other side of things, the WHO's reluctance to push on China is in part due to the fact that they felt that the more they push, the less access they get, and the more China shuts down. And so with non-transparent, non-democratic governments, there's always that balancing act in the international system. And that's why transparency is so important, because you push too hard and they shut down and you get nothing, but you don't push hard enough, then you don't get as much as you would like. And so that's why I would say one of many reasons why it's better to have a transparent democratic government that's accountable as opposed to, what we have in China. And I don't think you're going to disagree with me on that.
No, absolutely not. And I'd also say, again, this just goes to a conservative versus liberal view on a lot of international organizations. And the conservative view, and you can even say this is a money spending thing. Look, why not just take the money we're sending to the World Health Organization, which I'll give you probably does a whole lot of other good stuff in terms of preventing disease worldwide, but still at heart is not a scientific body; it's a political body. Why don't we take that money and keep it here, give it to the CDC, or spend it on state health agency preparation, that sort of thing. See, I guess that's the question: is could that money be better spent?
See, I don't think it's neither or.
Not relying on someone else who's or some other organization that is necessarily has to put other interests ahead of our own, or even ahead of global health.
Well, I would say it's not an either or type of thing. I think we could do more in both areas, certainly, and that I feel it's not surprising as a person to the left. I feel that our funding focus is sometimes very, very on the wrong sort of things, and we don't fund nearly enough of the sort of things I would like to see us fund instead of, and I referred earlier to the tax cut, that sort of thing. So,
well, exactly. Well, although after you just spent $2 trillion, it's kind of getting to be more an either or situation. We need to start looking at more things as either or situations.
Right. So yeah, I would be okay with legislation that would say rescind the tax cut. I'd be good for that. There's another, $1.5 trillion we can fix
the World Health Organization.
Well, not all of it certainly, but
that's your campaign slogan.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe I wouldn't get too far.
Raise your taxes and give it to these guys.
Yeah. Oh well. Okay, let's move on to recommendations. Jay, what do you got this week?
Oh, this is gonna seem weird, particularly to you, because we have a history on this issue. I've been watching Ken Burns's PBS show on country music.
Really?
And enjoying it immensely, more than I expected.
Wow.
And I know, you and I had, for viewers who don't know us, Mike at one time used to have what was called country night in the dorm, where you would.
Oh yeah, I remember you were not a big fan.
I was not a big fan.
It drove you out, I think, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I did. I found something else to do on country night.
Oh yeah.
But no, it's great, and I love this type of examination of sort of what's sort of the American soul, American character. You know what I mean?
Sure.
I dig that kind of stuff. So I'm enjoying it immensely. I also spent like about a week in Nashville about 2 years ago, and I really like that. And I do have an affection for sort of like older country music, the older kind of classic stuff. The stuff you were playing, was
raucous sort of. Yeah, I get you.
You were more like the.
There was more than a little bit of Hank Williams Jr. that would
yeah.
pop in there. Yeah, absolutely. No, yeah, I get that.
But
okay.
So anyway, no, I would recommend that to people, and I don't know if you can get it just on regular PBS. We've got it through an app thing, and because I am a PBS donor, in addition to my tote bag, I also get like free access to some of these shows.
Yeah.
So
all right. Well, I have a couple of things. First off, I just want to thank the folks who have been helping me out with my book in progress, The Reluctant Detective. And I have a bunch of chapters up. Now, there have been a lot of really useful comments and so forth. And as I have in weeks past, I will include the link on there so you can read along and comment and so forth. So thanks for that, guys. And secondly, my second recommendation is a show called I'm Sorry. It's on Hulu. And it stars Andrea Savage, who I just dearly love. I think she's just wonderful. There's even a political connection here. Now, the show is not political, but Andrea Savage actually graduated from Cornell with a major in government and a minor in law, according to Wikipedia. And she directed a 2012 sort of mock PSA called Republicans Get in My Vagina. And so I haven't checked that out yet, but I probably will. And she actually wrote that and stars in it, along with Kate Beckinsale and Judy Greer, who are two also awesome people. And finally, Andrea Savage had a recurring role in the HBO show Veep as President Laura Montez. So there's all kinds of sort of semi-political things, but Andrea Savage is just great. And it's just probably the funniest show that we're watching right now, and I highly recommend it. So there you go. All right. Well, everyone, thanks for listening. That is it for today's show. But Jay and I still have a lot more to talk about, including we're going to be talking about our COVID-19 sort of longer term predictions, proposals for the future, a bunch of other stuff. And all of that will be on the supporters midweek show, which every Patreon supporter gets. So again, to check that out, just go to patreon.com/politicsguys. And if you can't afford to become a sponsor, just email me, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will hook you up. And of course, again, if being a monthly supporter is too much of a commitment, but you still occasionally like to help us out, you can do that through PayPal. You can find the link on our website, politicsguys.com. Also, if you're not already a subscriber to the show, subscribing really does help, as does leaving ratings and reviews. And sharing episodes on social media is a very big deal to us. So thanks for doing that. Finally, if you want to get in touch with us for whatever reason, we love to get, questions, comments, feedback, that sort of thing. I already mentioned the what do you love, hate, feel indifferent about? I don't know. About the Politics Guys, mail@politicsguys.com. And of course, there's our bipartisan politics subreddit. We always put the URL there in the show notes, and that's been great. And finally, our Facebook page, facebook.com/politicsguys. Oh, I lied. Finally, we're on Twitter @politicsguys. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Bruce Johnson, Wilma Moreno, Andra Masker, Daniel Toe, and Chris Wilkerson. Today's show is produced by me, Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with a new show next week. We hope to join us.